International News Now.
Welcome to International News Now at UT. The idea for this YouTube channel grew out of a large introductory class on U.S. foreign policy that Rob and I teach every year to thousands of students at UT.
The course introduces students to some conceptual tools, largely drawn from political science, that can be used to evaluate America's larger role in the world. We examine how a series of domestic factors shape important foreign policy decisions of the United States.
And we examine how a larger international political order, often through war and globalization, constrains and remakes the interests and collective identity of the United States itself. Because this is a required course, we felt like we needed a device to hold students' attention and illustrate the usefulness of a series of abstract political science concepts.
And we solved this challenge by turning much of our analytical attention in class to exploring contemporary foreign policy debates that students were hearing about in the news. We sought to provide more background on these stories and discuss some of the larger theoretical and policy challenges they raised.
We quickly learned that our news updates were the favorite portion of the course. The students felt like these debates empowered them outside of the classroom, enhancing their confidence to engage family, friends, peers, and coworkers about the larger set of issues that were driving prominent public policy debates.
So then we decided that we might just as well make these videos from our class publicly available. So during the semesters in which we will teach, we will post to YouTube these news segments from our course. Again, we try to stay current with the news cycle, grabbing issues that can simultaneously get students talking about prominent national debates while allowing us to illustrate some foundational themes from our course on U.S. foreign policy.
Finally, we recognize that the challenges of engaging in a productive and civil dialogue in today's hyper-partisan political environment. As university instructors first, we do not and should not have a partisan axe to grind here. For reasons of full disclosure, we are both political centrists who frequently find lots to criticize about the public positions taken by members of both political parties in the United States.
Our principal goal in confronting these debates is simply to provide students with more analytical tools to think critically about what politicians from both parties are saying, and to push our students to think broadly about what America's role in the world today should be. Sometimes we will criticize because the facts and implications of actions point to certain potential outcomes that we may deem to be detrimental to U.S. interests or global stability. We will strive to be fair and objective, but most importantly honest about where we think the facts surrounding a particular issue lead. Now, the Iranian nuclear accord is what we're going to start with, and it stands out as one of the primary foreign policy legacies of the Obama administration. And let's just break it down into its simplest terms. The deal of the Iran nuclear deal involved a straightforward exchange. Iran agreed to end its program to develop nuclear weapons for at least 10 years. And in return, the United States, Europe, Russia, and China, all the other signatories besides Iran of the nuclear accord, agreed to end harsh sanctions, the harsh sanctions regime that crippled Iran's economy, especially after oil prices dropped significantly over the past year. So this was just an exchange of the end of a nuclear program for the end of sanctions on Iran. The sanctions had severely weakened Iran's ability to export or sell oil in global markets. The sanctions also froze Iran's financial assets in banks around the world. Thus, Iran did not have access to nearly $100 billion in offshore banking accounts because of these sanctions. The deal offered both sides something they wanted desperately. On one side, a non-nuclear Iran was a first priority interest for the United States. And on the other side, the end of sanctions was the priority for Iran. But at the same time that each side got something they desperately wanted, both sides also were forced to engage in painful negotiations with a professed enemy. Now we want to show you a quick video from Vox that outlines the most important components of this nuclear deal.
So negotiators from Iran and the six big world powers have just emerged from months of negotiations in Austria and Switzerland to announce that, believe it or not, they have an Iran nuclear deal.
Every pathway to a nuclear weapon is cut off.
But what does that actually mean? How does all that actually work? Well, this gets technical really fast, but it helps if you go through and look at some of the most important issues. One of the big ones is uranium. That's the stuff. You dig it out of the ground, use it for nuclear fuel for a power plant or even for a bomb. The deal requires Iran to give up 97% of its enriched uranium, almost all of it, down to just a 300 kilogram stockpile. Not very much. Uranium comes in different levels of enrichment. Now, this restriction is really severe. Iran is only allowed to have its uranium up to 3.67% enrichment. And to give you a sense of what that means, medical research grade uranium is enriched to 20%, and weapons grade uranium is enriched to 90%. So Iran's uranium is going to be way down at 3.67%, very safe in energy grade and not something that is anywhere near what can be used for a nuclear weapon. Iran is going to give up most of its centrifuges. It's going to go from 20,000 centrifuges to just 5,000 that are spinning fissile material, plus another 1,000 that it can use for research and development but can't use fissile material. And if Iran decided one day, you know what, we don't like this deal anymore, we're going to build a bomb, it would take it a really long time to do it. And that gets to another really important issue, and that's inspections. Inspections and monitoring are how we make sure that Iran is sticking to their end of the deal and that they're not cheating. The inspections that the U.S. got out of this deal are frankly just astonishing. One arms control analyst said he thought there was, quote, almost a 100% chance that if Iran cheated, it would be caught by these inspections. That's how good they are. So what does Iran get for accepting all of this? What Iran gets is relief from the economic sanctions that have been just crippling its economy. But what these sanctions do is they cut off Iran's economy from the outside world. They cut it off from international banking, international finance. These have been just devastating Iran's economy, and they are really desperate to get out from under these. And this is a big deal not just for Iran the state, but for the 77 million people of Iran who it's a big middle class, and they've been suffering under economic sanctions for too long, and they will finally get to have a chance at having a real economy, hopefully very soon after this.
All right, so what we want to do now is give some historical background to kind of put this deal, as described pretty positively in the Vox segment, into context. And we can date the strategic need to work on this agreement back to the American war against Iraq in 2003. Now recall that in the run-up to that war, President George W. Bush had lumped North Korea, Iran, and Iraq together in his so-called axis of evil. Accordingly, he identified each country as a rogue nation and a significant national security threat to the United States. While the United States opted for a military invasion against Iraq, it did not do so, it did not invade North Korea. Now, this is important because it sent an important signal to the Iranian regime. And that signal was this: you could get toppled by the United States and your regime could be changed through force by the United States if you did not possess nuclear weapons. Alternatively, you could deter war that might threaten your regime if you had nuclear weapons. At the time of that Iraq war, Iraq was rumored to be developing nuclear weapons but didn't have any. It got invaded. North Korea had already secured some. It did not get invaded. What did Iran do in response to this signal as they perceived it? Iran accelerated its nuclear weapons program in the midst of significant political change in the Middle East. Given that Saddam Hussein and his regime had long been an enemy of the Iranian regime, his military defeat by the United States strengthened Iran's position in the region. Moreover, democratic institutions in Iraq strengthened the domestic power of Iraqi Shia, this sect of Islam, and the Shia were more likely to favor a cooperative relationship between Iran and Iraq because of religious similarities between the Iraqi Shia and the Shia in Iran. By 2006, the International Atomic Energy Agency, or the IAEA, had declared that Iran was not in compliance with its obligation under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. The UN Security Council then voted later that year to impose economic sanctions on Iran for its non-compliance. The nuclear program also threatened Israel. The limited geographic size and population concentration of Israel, it's a very densely populated country, leaves it incredibly vulnerable to a decapitating nuclear strike. And Iran has a strong history of making military threats against Israel. Iran also supports Hezbollah in Lebanon, which has targeted Israel with terrorist attacks and military strikes. Consequently, Israel has consistently opposed the Iranian nuclear weapons program and pressured the United States to ensure that Iran would not acquire a nuclear weapon that could be launched against Israel. The Israeli government also sought American permission to launch a preemptive military strike against Iranian nuclear facilities in 2008, while the Bush administration was still in power.
So what we want to do now is we found a map, a website, that allows us to simulate the damage created by potential nuclear strikes. And as Rob mentioned, Israel is in a unique position because of its geographic proximity to Iran and because its small territorial base and the concentrated number of Israeli citizens that live in a small territorial base. And so they are particularly vulnerable to a nuclear strike by Iran. And this is coupled with an extreme concern created by long-term Iranian threats and stated political goals to destroy the Israeli regime. So in this website, what it allows us to do is make a series of assumptions and to give you some sense of the scope of damage that would be caused in Israel by a single nuclear strike. And we want to here illustrate why this security threat posed by Iran to Israel is so severe, because it has significant implications for American foreign policy. So here in the map, what I've done here, and this is the website is nuclearsecrecy.com, is simply we have a hypothetical nuclear strike. And what I'm doing here, and the target's Tel Aviv. And all we did was specify the yield of the nuclear weapon. In this case, I specified a nuclear weapon, or the size of a nuclear weapon that is estimated to be the most recent weapon tested by North Korea, which is about 150 kiloton nuclear explosion. I want to say Hiroshima and Nagasaki were about 20 kiloton explosions. So a lot bigger. And we center it here in Tel Aviv, and then we just hit detonate, and we can see some scope of, if I can get this. Now it's not going to do this for me. Try again. So it's not working. Sorry. Anyway, so let me tell you, so this gives you some sense right here of the scope of outer belts as the radiation damage. These are, in this area, these would be the people that would be killed in the nuclear explosion. When I ran this simulation last night, the size of this nuclear weapon, you're talking about initial casual or deaths in the fireball explosion of about 100 to 125,000 people if it hits Tel Aviv, and another 250,000 casualties. And the important thing to realize here, this is one nuclear weapon. right? To give you a larger sense, the population of Israel is about 8.5 million. And so you're talking about one nuclear weapon killing a significant proportion of their population. We haven't even talked about 2 or 3 or 4 nuclear weapons. All of a sudden, we can think we see how severe this threat is to the state of Israel when they can realistically talk about not being able to absorb a nuclear strike and being able to continue to exist as a country. All right, so now let's talk a little bit about the broader security threat posed by, can I have you switch over here a little bit so I can see? So more broadly, the United States, Israel, Russia, and China, and many European countries sought, given the security threat, sought to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons for a host of reasons. They worried that a nuclear-armed Iran could provoke a preventive war launched by Israel, given the threat that we've just described. They worried that a nuclear-armed Iran would force Saudi Arabia into developing its own nuclear weapons. And the rest of the world worried that a nuclear Iran could use those weapons in a future war or share them with terrorists. Accordingly, we can simultaneously think about the Iran nuclear accord as an attempt to negotiate a peace settlement in the region to prevent Israeli pressure for a preventive war against Iran. The negotiators hoped it would reduce pressure to launch a military strike against Iran to halt its nuclear weapons program, and it would help prevent a future war fought against a nuclear Iran. So if this agreement arguably helped to preserve peace in the region, then why did Israel, Republicans in Congress object to the deal? So let's take each of one of these issues in turn and talk some more about the objections. First, Republicans and Israel shared many of the same objections to the deal. First, they argued that it was not strong enough. The deal essentially had a 10-year window on it. Hypothetically, Iran could restart its nuclear weapons program in 10 years. They felt that this temporal window was too short and preferred to maintain economic and political pressure on Iran in a way that would make it more difficult to resume the nuclear weapons program at any point. Now, Vice President Pence made this very argument yesterday in a speech to the Israeli parliament when he strongly criticized the Iran nuclear deal and said that it would not stand in its current form. We've got a clip of his speech right now. Let's go ahead and play that.
2.5 years ago, the previous administration in America signed a deal with Iran that merely delays the day when that regime can acquire a nuclear weapon. The Iran nuclear deal is a disaster, and the United States of America will no longer certify this ill-conceived agreement. At President Trump's direction, we're working to enact effective and lasting restraints on Iran's nuclear and ballistic missile programs. Earlier this month, the President waived sanctions on Iran to give the Congress and our European allies time to pass stronger measures. But as President Trump made clear, this is the last time. Unless the Iran nuclear deal is fixed, President Trump has said the United States will withdraw from the Iran nuclear deal immediately.
All right, second, we're talking about objections to this again. Republicans in the Israeli government were deeply concerned about the financial bonanza that Iran received as part of this deal. Now let's be clear, this was not a payment of American funds to the Iranian government. Instead, this deal unlocked Iranian funds that had been deposited in Western financial institutions. Now, Republicans and the Israelis worried that these funds could then be used to ramp up military spending in Iran and its sponsorship of terrorism in the region. Now, third, Republican critics expect future bad behavior from Iran. They're worried about, again, the sponsorship of terrorism, and they wanted provisions in the deal that would penalize Iran for that. But they didn't want to eliminate the sanctions regime. They wanted to keep that in place, forcing Iran to make more concessions than just giving up their nuclear weapons. The idea here was to constrain Iranian power in the region. And we should add a fourth component to these broader set of rejections. And this is the standard partisan argument that drives much of what's going on in Washington, D.C. today. Many Republicans oppose the Iran nuclear deal because the Democrats and President Obama supported it. All right, now all of these objections led to a last-minute deal between President Obama and Congress to approve the nuclear accord in the summer of 2015. As we will talk about in future modules, the Constitution holds that international treaties need to acquire support or approval from 2/3 of the Senate. There was no way President Obama could have secured this level of support from the Senate. As a consequence, he threatened to implement the provisions of the treaty through executive order. This meant that he would just act as though an international treaty was in place with Iran, and he would just then direct the agencies of the executive branch that he headed to observe the terms of the deal that had been reached without securing Senate approval. Republican senators created, actually it was a bipartisan compromise, led by Senator Corker from Tennessee, that created a compromise that reinserted Congress into the treaty approval or ratification process here over the Iran nuclear accord. Even though, again, nobody's calling it a treaty. They are intentionally not calling it a treaty because then that would require formal Senate approval. Now, these are important legislative provisions to this deal that was constructed in May of 2015 because they are now structuring how President Trump is handling this issue. So we want to take a few minutes and briefly identify them here. Now, first, in May of 2015, Congress passed the Iran Nuclear Agreement Review Act of 2015. This forced the president to submit any nuclear accord to Congress for review. During a review period, the president was prohibited from waiving sanctions. Remember, these are the penalty device that's designed to ensure Iranian compliance. Again, this step was important because Obama could not unilaterally begin implementing the agreement. He had to give Congress a chance to review it. Second, Congress held a vote on, and it's weird, but it's important. Congress held a vote on whether or not to disagree with the treaty. If more than a majority voted to disagree with the treaty, then President Obama could veto that disagreement vote. This meant that Congress needed to secure a veto-proof majority. That is, 2/3 of legislators had to disagree with the nuclear agreement in both houses of Congress to block the agreement from going into effect. As a serious and legislative hurdle that everybody knew wasn't going to get passed. And third, and this is the big one for President Trump, the legislation forced the president to certify to Congress every 180 days that Iran was in compliance with the final agreement. So in September of 2015, 42 Democratic senators filibustered the piece of legislation in which Congress could express their disapproval of the treaty. This meant that they prevented the bill from coming up for a formal vote in the Senate, and this effectively killed the congressional bill that was designed to try and block the president from implementing the nuclear deal that he and his administration had negotiated with Iran and the P5+1 countries.
All right, so that's what happened under the Obama administration. So let's fast forward to October of 2017. We have a new president then, President Trump and his administration. And the Republicans in general, all the Republicans that ran for president, but especially Donald Trump, have consistently criticized this nuclear accord. The Nuclear Review Act signed in May of 2015 gave President Trump the power to decertify the deal, which meant saying that Iran was not in compliance with the agreement. He initially, Trump that is, initially certified the deal in the first few months of his administration. But he regularly had to come back to this question of certification. So he then chose to decertify the deal in October 2017 and declare that Iran was not in compliance with the nuclear accord. Now we are going to watch a quick video to get some background on that decision to decertify the nuclear deal with Iran now.
And another major move from the president today, decertifying the Iran nuclear agreement, telling Congress to impose new sanctions or he'll leave the deal completely. Swift reaction from many U.S. allies tonight. And here's ABC's chief White House correspondent, Jonathan Karl.
Defying some of America's closest allies and even some of his own advisors, the president today declared that Iran is not keeping its side of the nuclear agreement negotiated under President Obama.
The Iran deal was one of the worst and most one-sided transactions the United States has ever entered into.
The president called on Congress to impose new sanctions on Iran if it does not curb its missile program and its support for terrorism, things not covered under the nuclear agreement.
The Iranian regime continues to fuel conflict, terror, and turmoil throughout the Middle East and beyond. Importantly, Iran is not living up to the spirit of the deal.
But President Trump stopped short of doing what he had said he would do during the campaign: get out of the deal, a step that would give Iran the green light to restart its nuclear weapons program.
Mr. President, you had said you were going to rip the Iran deal up, and you called it the worst ever.
Well, I may do that. I may do that. The deal is terrible. So what we've done is, through the certification process, we'll have Congress take a look at it, and I may very well do that.
Even before the president spoke, Secretary of State Rex Tillerson had been working the phones to reassure European allies who are firmly committed to the Iran deal.
So let's get to John Karl live at the White House tonight. And John, Secretary Tillerson, as you point out, they're given the task of calling our allies. What is he hearing on the other end of the line?
Well, they're not particularly happy with the president's actions, but after those conversations, what's notable is that France, Germany, and the UK did not directly criticize the president and said they would work with the United States on curbing Iran's support for terrorism and its missile program. David, as for Iran, the Iranian president said that the United States is completely alone on this, but the Iranians said that they will stay in the agreement, at least for now. David?
John Karl at the White House on a Friday night for us. Thank you, John.
All right, a couple of things to note about this video. Remember, it's from October of 2017. That's when President Trump made the decision to decertify the Iran nuclear deal. The first point to make is Trump said that Iran was not living up to the spirit of the deal. He did not specifically say that Iran is violating the nuclear provisions within the deal, and this is a crucial distinction. The second point to make, Trump wants a new deal that pressures Iran into reducing support for terrorism and limits its ballistic missile program. And he is willing to reimpose new sanctions on Iran if Iran does not make concessions along these lines. So he wants to renegotiate their deal, and this goes to his position, which he says is originally the deal was a terrible deal. Now, the third point, and most importantly, despite decertifying the deal, President Trump placed responsibility onto Congress to do something about the Iran nuclear deal. He just decertified it, but what specific action was going to be taken was up to Congress. Now, this something to do includes potentially imposing new sanctions or securing new concessions from Iran. Now, under the terms of decertification, Congress had 60 days to reimpose new sanctions. In December of 2017, Congress chose not to reimpose new sanctions by simply allowing this deadline to pass. Now, let me reemphasize again, this is significant because Republicans in Congress possess majorities in both the House of Representatives and the Senate. They could have reimposed sanctions. They opted not to pursue the tougher foreign policy approach that Trump favors. Instead, they effectively told the president that they didn't want to lead on Iran policy and essentially ceded control over the policy back to President Trump. So let's bring this up to January, right now. On Friday, January 12th, President Trump announced that he was opting not to reimpose economic sanctions on Iran for its nuclear program. In other words, the United States will continue to abide by the agreement for now, despite the decertification. However, Trump also said that he will reimpose sanctions under certain conditions, and the conditions are this. If Europe does not join with him in imposing tougher restrictions on Iran that limit its ability to break out of the accord and restart its nuclear program quickly. So just to summarize, despite his opposition to the nuclear deal, President Trump has yet to withdraw from this international agreement. He is threatening to do so unless Iran makes new concessions. And Vice President Pence reiterated that threat in Israel just yesterday. This leads to an important political question, though. Can the Trump administration secure sufficient concessions from Iran and Europe to keep the deal in place? Can he get a new deal? So let's pass it back to Pat to address this question.
All right, so we raise this question because it allows us to circle back to one of the main themes of this module. President Trump doesn't make U.S. foreign policy in a vacuum, dictated solely by his or American national interests. The United States exists in a larger international system that constrains its ability to get what it wants, which in this case is a new round of concessions from Iran that would limit its ballistic missile program. Remember that a series of European countries signed off on this deal in 2015. They want it to remain in place. European countries and China, the P5+1 was the framework. They want it to remain in place. They would need to be parties to any revisions. We should be skeptical that they want to make any big concessions to the president. Relations between the United States and its key allies in Europe, including the United Kingdom, France, and Germany, have deteriorated significantly over the past year. Moreover, the United States would need the original signatories of the deal to sign off on the use of new sanctions to pressure Iran to comply with any demands to curb its ballistic missile program or reduce its support for terrorism, which is often linked to its support for Hezbollah. Without the approval of these other countries, Iran, and without their approval to impose sanctions on Iran, Iran could continue to sell oil to European countries even if the United States unilaterally imposed an embargo and refused to import Iranian oil. In other words, the United States cannot impose an effective sanctions regime against Iran on its own. Again, this illustrates some of the global political challenges for American foreign policy. It's constrained by a larger set of systemic pressures that hinder its political ability to achieve its foreign policy goals unilaterally. And right now, I think we could make an argument that these systemic constraints are pressuring the Trump administration into upholding an international agreement that it really hates.